7 years. That's how long it took to build the Gordie Howe International Bridge. 7 years, $4 billion, 1.5 miles of cable-stayed steel and concrete stretched across the Detroit River, connecting the busiest trade corridor in North America. And when it was finally, actually finished, sitting complete, tested, and ready for its first truck to cross, it didn't open. Not because of a structural problem, not because of a safety inspection. It sat there, fully built, indefinitely delayed, because the President of the United States decided a finished bridge connecting two allied countries was actually the perfect piece of leverage to extract exactly the kind of concession he'd been trying to get through tariffs, threats, and trade negotiations for over a year. And it worked. If you've been wondering how a bridge, an actual physical, completed piece of infrastructure, became a bargaining chip in one of the most contentious trade relationships in modern North American history, stay with me, because this story tells you almost everything you need to know about how the Trump administration has approached Canada throughout this entire year, and why the bridge finally opening on July 27th isn't really the end of this story. It's just the latest chapter in a much longer, much more calculated economic pressure campaign. Let's start with what actually happened, because the timeline here is genuinely remarkable once you lay it out in order. The Gordie Howe International Bridge was originally supposed to open with a proper ribbon-cutting ceremony sometime around early to mid-2026, following years of construction delays tied to the pandemic, and later, unrelated issues finishing the ports of entry facilities on both the American and Canadian sides. By the time construction was genuinely complete, this was supposed to be a straightforward celebration. A new 6-lane crossing easing pressure on the aging Ambassador Bridge, speeding up automotive production that depends on parts crossing this exact river multiple times during manufacturing, and generating what officials on both sides described as billions of dollars in economic activity for decades to come. Instead, in February of this year, President Trump threatened not to allow the bridge to open at all until, in his words, the United States was compensated for what he claimed was unfair treatment by the Canadian government. One of the specific allegations he made was that the entire project had used only Canadian steel in its construction, an allegation Canadian officials, including Prime Minister Mark Carney himself, directly refuted. Think about what that threat actually represents for a moment, because it's worth sitting with. This wasn't a tariff on a category of imported goods. It wasn't a trade restriction on a specific industry. It was a completed, functioning piece of critical infrastructure, jointly built and paid for primarily by Canadian taxpayers, that the American president was explicitly willing to keep closed indefinitely, unless Canada agreed to additional financial terms he considered fair. That threat held for months. A planned opening ceremony, scheduled for June, was delayed to give the two governments more time to resolve what officials on both sides carefully described only as outstanding issues. And then, in early July, after months of quiet negotiation, the two countries finally reached an agreement. According to reporting from the Wall Street Journal, cited by Fox Business, the deal that unlocked the bridge's opening included a series of cooperative measures, specifically governing how tolls would be administered on the crossing. And buried inside that agreement was the detail that actually tells you everything about what this entire standoff was really about. Both sides agreed that half of the net profit the bridge generates will go to a regional development fund. Read that again, because it's genuinely significant. A bridge financed almost entirely by Canadian public money, built specifically to serve a trade corridor where 70% of everything Canada exports flows through to the United States, will now share half of its net profits with a fund benefiting the region, rather than that revenue flowing entirely back to the Canadian government and Canadian taxpayers who actually paid to build it. Trump's own public statement on the deal, posted after the agreement was finalized, was almost gleeful in tone. He described the original arrangement as unacceptable to him personally and called the renegotiated terms great and fair, thanking the Canadian government and wishing both countries many years of success with what he called this wonderful new development. Now, if you're new to how this entire relationship has deteriorated over the past year and a half, make sure you're subscribed, because understanding the bridge dispute in isolation genuinely doesn't tell you the full story. You need to understand the broader pattern this incident fits into, because the Gordie Howe Bridge wasn't an isolated flare-up between two allies who otherwise get along fine. It was one specific, physical, highly visible example of a strategy Trump has been applying to Canada consistently since taking office, using economic leverage, tariffs, delayed infrastructure, threatened trade penalties, to extract concessions from a neighbor whose economy, by nearly every measure available, has far less room to absorb sustained economic pressure than America's does. Let's back up to understand exactly how deep this trade conflict actually runs, because the tariff timeline alone tells a genuinely striking story. On February 1st of last year, Trump signed an executive order imposing tariffs on Canadian exports to the United States at 25% across nearly all products, with a reduced 10% rate specifically applied to energy, critical minerals, and potash. That was the opening move. By August, those tariffs had climbed further still, rising from 25% to 35%, following a deadline Trump had set for Canada to reach a broader trade agreement or face exactly this kind of escalation. Canada's negotiating team was in Washington right up until the deadline, with Prime Minister Carney publicly acknowledging his country might not land a deal in time. And in a detail that captures just how unpredictable this entire relationship has become, Trump posted on social media, shortly after midnight on the day the deadline expired, that Canada's announcement supporting Palestinian statehood would make it, in his own words, very hard for the two countries to reach a trade deal, an entirely separate geopolitical issue suddenly injected directly into a bilateral trade negotiation. Now, most tariffs under the broader Canada-United States-Mexico agreement, known as CUSMA in Canada and USMCA in the United States, don't actually apply to the majority of goods crossing the border, because that trade agreement specifically exempts most products. But certain categories, steel, copper, and specific automotive parts among them, remain subject to these escalating American tariffs, regardless of the broader trade agreement's protections. And Canada's economic exposure to this pressure is genuinely enormous compared to America's exposure to Canada. Historian Robert Bothwell, commenting on the dynamic between the two leaders, put it about as plainly as it can be put. Trump represents more of a problem for Carney than for almost anyone else, precisely because Canada is more economically exposed to the United States than any other major trading partner America has. That exposure showed up in hard economic numbers throughout last year. Canada's GDP shrank by 1.6% in a single quarter, with unemployment climbing above 7% by that August. Those aren't abstract statistics. That's the direct, measurable cost of sustained tariff pressure landing on an economy that sends the overwhelming majority of its exports to a single trading partner, a partner that, throughout this same period, was simultaneously threatening not to open a bridge Canada had already paid billions of dollars to build. Here's where the story genuinely escalates, because Canada's response to this pressure produced one of the most dramatic moments in the entire relationship. Facing sustained economic damage, Carney signaled what analysts described as a strategic pivot away from the United States entirely, beginning with a security and defense partnership signed with Europe back in June of last year. Then, in January of this year, Carney traveled to Beijing, the first Canadian prime ministerial visit to China since 2017, and struck a preliminary trade agreement specifically designed to reduce tensions between the two countries. Under that deal, Canada agreed to allow 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into its market annually at a sharply reduced tariff rate of 6.1%, down from the 100% tariff Canada had imposed on Chinese electric vehicles back in October of 2024, a decision it had made specifically in coordination with the United States at the time. Trump's reaction to Canada's China deal tells you everything about how he views Canada's room to maneuver independently in its own foreign and trade policy. He threatened, in a direct social media post, to impose a full 100% tariff on all Canadian exports if Ottawa proceeded with any broader free trade agreement with Beijing, warning explicitly that if Carney thought he could turn Canada into what Trump called a drop-off port for China to funnel goods into the United States, he was sorely mistaken. Carney's response was carefully calibrated, clarifying publicly that Canada had no intention of pursuing a comprehensive free trade agreement with China, and emphasizing that the more limited deal already reached was entirely consistent with Canada's existing obligations under CUSMA, while still highlighting the genuine economic benefits it unlocked, more than $7 billion in new export markets specifically for Canadian farmers, ranchers, and fish harvesters. This is the environment the Gordie Howe Bridge dispute actually took place within, not an isolated disagreement about steel sourcing on a single infrastructure project, but one specific flashpoint inside a much broader, sustained pattern of economic pressure, tariff escalation, and leverage extraction that has defined the entire Trump-Carney relationship since Carney became Prime Minister in March of last year. Former American ambassador to Canada. James Blanchard has reportedly described this relationship, in blunt terms, as the worst in modern history between the two countries, a characterization that becomes considerably easier to understand once you see just how many separate fronts this economic pressure campaign has actually opened simultaneously. Now let's talk about the timing of the bridge deal specifically, because it lines up with a genuinely important deadline that had been looming over the entire relationship throughout the first half of this year. The scheduled review of the USMCA trade agreement, the broader treaty governing nearly all trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, was set for July 1st of this year. Ahead of that review, at the G7 summit held in France back in June, Trump himself publicly floated the possibility that he might not even renew the entire agreement, a statement that would represent an almost unthinkable escalation given how deeply intertwined the three North American economies have become since the original agreement's predecessor first took effect in the early 1990s. Canada's minister responsible for the U.S. Trade, Dominic LeBlanc, was in Washington in early June, meeting directly with United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer specifically to exchange proposals ahead of that CUSMA review, describing himself as optimistic about how the year's broader review process would unfold. But even that meeting came wrapped in additional pressure. On the same day LeBlanc met with Greer, Greer's office released a separate report listing dozens of countries, Canada explicitly included among them, as having what the report characterized as varying degrees of ineffective enforcement around goods manufactured using forced labor, a designation that opens the door to entirely new categories of import levies layered on top of the tariffs already in place. LeBlanc's own public response made the connection explicit, noting on social media that this development wasn't a surprise, given that the United States had already signaled its intention to replace existing baseline global tariffs, ones that had recently been overturned through separate legal action, with new tariff authority once the previous framework's legal basis expired in July. If you're keeping track of how many separate, simultaneous pressure points this represents, you're starting to understand exactly why the bridge dispute wasn't really about steel or tolls or a regional development fund at all. It was one additional lever among several already being pulled simultaneously, timed specifically to add pressure right as the broader CUSMA review deadline approached. Now, here's where it's genuinely worth pausing to consider the case for why this approach, treating a bridge as negotiating leverage, tariffs as a routine tool of foreign policy, and trade deals as instruments tied to entirely separate geopolitical disputes, might actually make strategic sense from Washington's perspective, because there is a real argument here worth taking seriously rather than dismissing outright. Trump has been remarkably consistent and explicit about his own underlying philosophy on this specific question. He has described himself directly, in his own words, as what he calls a tariffs person, someone who genuinely believes in the relative simplicity of imposing broad economic levies, specifically to raise government revenue, while creating direct financial incentive for manufacturing and production to relocate back within American borders, rather than remaining spread across allied economies like Canada's. From this perspective, every one of these individual disputes, the bridge, the steel tariffs, the automotive parts tariffs, the forced labor enforcement levies, represents a consistent, coherent application of a single underlying economic theory, not a series of disconnected, opportunistic power plays against a smaller neighbor. There's also a legitimate argument that Canada's own economic decisions throughout this period genuinely did create friction that reasonable trade partners might respond to with some degree of tension. Canada's decision to reduce tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, even through a limited agreement rather than a comprehensive free trade deal, does represent a genuine divergence from the coordinated approach the two countries had taken toward China as recently as late 2024. Whether or not Trump's specific 100% tariff threat represented a proportionate response, the underlying American concern that Canada could function as an indirect pathway for Chinese goods to reach the American market at reduced tariff rates through the existing protections built into CUSMA, reflects a genuine substantive policy question, rather than simply manufactured pretext for economic pressure. And regarding the bridge specifically, there's a narrower version of the American argument worth acknowledging directly. Trump's original public complaint centered on the claim that the bridge project had used exclusively Canadian steel throughout its construction. And while Canadian officials disputed that specific characterization, the broader question of how binational infrastructure projects allocate costs, benefits, and revenue between the two contributing governments is not, on its own, an unreasonable thing for either side to negotiate carefully before a shared asset actually opens for business. The final agreement, splitting net profits between the two countries through a regional development fund rather than allowing all bridge revenue to flow entirely to one side, isn't inherently an unfair or extractive outcome. Reasonable people could genuinely disagree about whether that specific revenue-sharing structure represents fair compensation for a jointly used binational crossing, or whether it represents exactly the kind of unnecessary manufactured leverage this story suggests it does. So, given all of that legitimate nuance, why does the broader pattern still deserve to be described as a trade trap rather than simply routine, if unusually aggressive, trade diplomacy between two close allies? The answer comes down to three specific dynamics that emerge clearly once you look at the full pattern across this entire year, rather than any single dispute in isolation. The first dynamic is sequencing. Every single major economic pressure point applied to Canada throughout this period arrived precisely timed to coincide with, or immediately precede, some other significant deadline or negotiation Canada was already navigating. The bridge threat emerged in February, shortly after the initial 25% tariffs took effect. The escalation to 35% tariffs arrived right at Canada's negotiating deadline in early August of last year, accompanied by an entirely unrelated geopolitical grievance over Palestinian statehood recognition suddenly inserted into the trade conversation. The China deal threat arrived within a week of Canada actually signing that preliminary agreement, and the forced labor enforcement report arrived on the exact same day Canadian officials were in Washington attempting to make constructive progress on the broader CUSMA review. This isn't a pattern consistent with routine, good faith trade negotiation happening on its own natural timeline. It's a pattern consistent with deliberately maximizing pressure at precisely the moments Canada has the least room to maneuver. The second dynamic is asymmetry, and this is where the earlier point about Canada's economic exposure becomes genuinely central to understanding why this specific pattern of pressure works as effectively as it has. When 70% of your country's exports flow to a single trading partner, and that partner controls both tariff policy and apparently the opening date of critical shared infrastructure, the negotiating leverage in every single one of these disputes overwhelmingly favors the larger economy, regardless of how each individual dispute gets publicly framed. Canada's GDP contraction and rising unemployment throughout last year weren't abstract consequences of a mutual disagreement between equals. They were the direct, measurable cost of an asymmetric economic relationship being actively leveraged, repeatedly across multiple simultaneous fronts. The third dynamic, and the one that genuinely justifies the trade trap framing specifically applied to the bridge itself, is the deliberate conversion of a completed, jointly beneficial piece of physical infrastructure into a bargaining chip. Tariffs, however aggressive or poorly timed, at least function within the broader, recognized category of trade policy tools that governments routinely adjust and negotiate. But the Gordie Howe Bridge wasn't a policy under negotiation. It was a finished, tested, ready-to-operate physical structure built specifically to benefit both economies simultaneously that sat closed for months well past its intended opening date, specifically because one side of the partnership determined that withholding its use represented additional leverage worth extracting before allowing it to actually function as intended. That is a meaningfully different category of pressure than adjusting a tariff schedule, because it takes something both countries already jointly built and paid for, and holds it hostage to extract terms neither side had originally agreed to during construction. Let's talk about what this actually means going forward, because the bridge opening on July the 27th doesn't resolve the broader pattern this dispute represents. It simply closes one specific chapter of it. First, watch how the broader CUSMA review process concludes in the coming months, because that review represents by far the most consequential remaining piece of this entire relationship. Trump's own suggestion at the G7 summit that he might simply decline to renew the agreement entirely would represent an economic shock to the Canadian economy, considerably larger than any single tariff escalation or infrastructure dispute, discussed throughout this entire story. Whether that review produces a genuine, durable renewal, a significantly renegotiated agreement, or prolonged standoff similar to the pattern established by the bridge dispute will tell you a great deal about whether this entire relationship stabilizes or continues along the same escalating trajectory it's followed for the past year and a half. Second, watch whether the forced labor enforcement tariffs Greer's office signaled back in June actually materialize as concrete policy, and how broadly they get applied to Canadian goods specifically. Given the pattern established throughout this story of announcements arriving precisely timed to coincide with other ongoing negotiations, the timing and scope of any formal action on this front will likely tell you more about the underlying negotiating strategy than the stated policy rationale around forced labor enforcement itself. Third, keep a close eye on how Canada's broader pivot away from exclusive reliance on the American market actually develops. The security and defense partnership with Europe, the trade agreement with China, and Carney's own public rhetoric about rallying what he's described as middle powers to respond to an increasingly unpredictable global climate all suggest a genuine, deliberate Canadian strategy to reduce the specific kind of economic exposure that has made this entire year of pressure so effective against Ottawa. Whether that diversification strategy produces meaningful results, or whether Canada's deep structural dependence on the American market makes any genuine pivot more aspirational than achievable in the near term, will significantly shape how much continued leverage the United States retains over Canada and future disputes similar to this one. And fourth, watch how the Regional Development Fund established through the bridge agreement actually gets structured and administered once real toll revenue starts flowing after the July 27th opening. The specific mechanics of exactly how that shared profit gets allocated, who sits on whatever board or authority ultimately controls it, and how transparently that revenue sharing actually operates in practice will tell you whether this specific agreement represents a genuinely fair, jointly beneficial resolution to the dispute, or whether it simply formalizes exactly the kind of extractive arrangement critics of this entire pattern have argued it represents. Here's the truth sitting underneath this entire story, and it's worth stating plainly, rather than dressing up in diplomatic language, neither side has actually used throughout this dispute. A bridge that took 7 years and $4 billion to build, financed overwhelmingly by Canadian taxpayers, specifically designed to strengthen an economic relationship both countries have relied on for decades, sat closed for months after its actual completion, not because of any remaining construction or safety concern, but because the President of the United States recognized that a finished, valuable, mutually beneficial piece of infrastructure represented genuine leverage, and he was willing to use it. Canada agreed to share half the bridge's net profits through a regional development fund it hadn't originally planned to create, arriving at that concession only after months of delay, layered on top of an entire year of tariff escalations, geopolitical linkage tactics, and threatened trade penalties tied to Canada's own independent foreign policy decisions. The bridge finally opens on July the 27th, connecting the busiest trade corridor in North America exactly the way it was always designed to. But the way it got there tells you something considerably more important than the bridge itself, that in this specific economic relationship, even completed, jointly beneficial infrastructure isn't safe from becoming a bargaining chip. And Canada, given its overwhelming economic dependence on a single trading partner, has repeatedly found itself with remarkably little room to do anything except eventually agree to whatever terms make that leverage go away. If this gave you a clearer picture of what was actually happening behind the ribbon-cutting ceremony and the celebratory headlines about a new bridge finally opening, share it with someone still trying to understand why Canada-US relations have deteriorated this dramatically over the past year and a half, and stay subscribed, because between the looming Kuzma review, the forced labor tariff threat, and Canada's own broader pivot toward Europe and China, this particular trade relationship is clearly still being renegotiated in real time, one piece of leverage at a time.